Minnesota Twins general manager Jeremy Zoll, in his first interview as the head of the Twins front office, mentions a pair of starters who will convert to the bullpen in 2026, and why I think one of them has a great chance to make the opening day bullpen.
You are Locked On Twins, your daily Minnesota Twins podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome in to Locked On Twins. I'm CJ Baumgartner, host of the show. Glad you can make it today. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, now the #1 sports podcast network. Today, we're looking at the #2 moment of the Minnesota Twins offseason and why it's going to come from the bench, and the Twins offseason report card from The Athletic that's maybe going to want the Twins going back to school. But first, new Twins general manager. Well, he's been the general manager, but now he's the new head of the Twins front office. Jeremy Zoll was on Inside Twins and had some things to say regarding the 2026 bullpen. Inside Twins is a show that the Treasure Island Baseball Network does, and Jeremy Zoll was the guest this week, and just about a half-hour interview. It's on the Minnesota Twins YouTube page if you want to go back and listen to that whole interview, but I listened to it all, so that way I can just give you the highlights and what you need to know. And the biggest thing comes from the Minnesota Twins bullpen. Jeremy Zoll says that Travis Adams and Marco Raya will convert to full-time relievers in the bullpen. And he mentioned a couple things of what does it take, when a team wants to look at a reliever, whether it's a starter going to be a reliever or whether it's a reliever in general. He mentioned, how does their stuff play? Can you generate swings and misses, which is going to be a big thing if you want to be a member of the Minnesota Twins bullpen and really any bullpen in baseball, but creating those swings and misses, creating unique looks for the hitters. And they mentioned they could do some things like tweaking pitch mixes, grips, etc., things that, again, every organization does, but those are the things that Zoll says that they're going to work on with some of their pitchers here when spring training begins next week, when pitchers and catchers report. But the reason is, and he was asked this question because there are 13 starting pitchers on the 40-man roster. Obviously, you only need 5 for a big league roster, and you're going to have a few kind of on retainer that are going to be pitching in AAA regardless, but that still leaves just a very big pool of starting pitchers, or at least the position they're classified as, that you're probably not going to use as much of. So could some of those guys have a better path to the big leagues if the Twins convert them to be a relief pitcher? And there were 2 names that he mentioned. It was obviously vague stuff. And I think overall he said, there's more guys that we could look at. We're not going to make any announcement on everybody switching over that could, because we're going to see how spring training plays out. We're going to give guys opportunities to be a starter if they want to, because generally speaking, pitchers want to be starters. You make money as a starting pitcher. You get more notoriety. You have a chance to pitch more, whether, instead of throwing 100 pitches every 5 days, you go down to throwing 15 pitches every 3 days. It's a little bit different. And obviously, in that athlete mindset, you want to be the guy. And again, you just make more money as a starting pitcher. Your path to career earnings is higher as even just a middle of the road starting pitcher than it is as a lockdown bullpen arm. So that's kind of why guys are hesitant. It's why teams try, out of respect for players, not to just banish them to the bullpen unless there is good reason. And for the Minnesota Twins, more could be coming. We mentioned that on last week's show where, the Twins aren't going to announce Connor Prelip is going to be moved to the bullpen until like a week before spring training. They did the same thing with Jhoan Duran. He was a starter all throughout the 2022 spring training, albeit it was a little bit different considering that was post-lockout, but he came back onto the big league. He made his way to the big league roster because the Twins moved him from a starter to a reliever. And if you remember, there was clips of him going like, yeah, I'd still like to start someday. Louis Varland, when he got moved to the bullpen, or when he went to the bullpen in 2023, people were like, do you want to be a bullpen guy full time? Seems like you're good in this role. And he's like, I still want to try and be a starting pitcher. And obviously he ended up moving to the bullpen, but guys really want to exhaust every opportunity to become a starting pitcher. So it's not something you can do lightly. And as Twins general manager Jeremy Zoll said in the interview, and he's correct about this, it's a lot easier to ramp somebody down to being a reliever than it is to ramp them back up to being a starter. It's preparation, it's workload, it's all that kind of stuff. And the Twins aren't just going to go, nah, Connor Prelip, you're a reliever in spring training. And then at the end of it go, nah, you know what? We don't need you in the bullpen. Why don't you just go be a starter again? It's a lot easier to give them every opportunity in spring training. And then the last week or two kind of start to have that conversation of, look, man, your best chance at being on the big league roster is being a reliever. Like, that's the path we think you should take, whatever. So there are two names that Jeremy Zoll mentioned, and it was Travis Adams and Marco Raya. So let's first take a breakdown of Travis Adams. Made a couple starts last year for the Twins. Not great, allowed 29 runs and 33 and 2/3 innings and 2 starts and 3 appearances. And this is what you get a lot of with relievers, is they are failed starters. If you remember, I believe it was Andrew Chaffin with the Chicago Cubs, maybe it was somebody else, had a shirt that just said failed starter on it. And that was what the bullpen guys all wore around, because that's typically how a lot of the best bullpen arms, whether you're LaTroy Hawkins, whether you're Joan Duran, whether you're even John Smoltz at the end of his career, was a great closer, or at least a very effective closer. But again, it's somebody who's like, you're not going to play as a starter anymore. So if you want your big league career to continue, you're going to need to come out of the bullpen. And for Travis Adams, rough. He moved into the bullpen in September, and you did see that fastball velocity start to rise. This happened in St. Paul a lot, but again, in 95 plus mile an hour fastball, you could theoretically see maybe get a notch or two up if you really just let him go full on into the bullpen and give him that full offseason to prepare like he's going into the bullpen. He had a 6-pitch mix when he was a starter. Now you're likely going to see that get whittled down to at least the fastball, probably the slider. He got some pretty good whiffs on that one. I would argue his changeup probably should be kept in that mix, considering when you look at the whiff rate, and again, if we're talking swings and misses that Jeremy Zoll wants, 32.6% whiff rate on the slider and on the changeup. So if you have both of those pitches that can generate a swing and a miss a third of the time you throw them, it's a pretty good rate. Combine that with a 95 mile per hour fastball, maybe get it up to 96, 97 if things go right. There's a path there, right, for Travis Adams. It's not going to be as a closer. It's not going to be as this high leverage, Joan Duran, Griffin Jacks type, but I think there is a path for Travis Adams to be a very solid 6th, maybe 7th inning man to come in and handle some situations. And again, just giving the Twins one more body that they can throw in that pile of relievers. The thing is he doesn't really have just that massive stuff, the things that you're looking for where it's like, whoa, this guy's slider blows you out of the water. He's able to get some swings and misses, which is important. It's not necessarily going to rank on the top of the Stuff Plus rankings, or it's not going to be on any baseball highlight videos that circulate through social media. But I think you could see a path for Travis Adams being an effective, kind of middle to low leverage situation reliever. You're not going to throw him in the 8th inning with runners on the corners and 1 out in a tie game. But can you throw, if Pablo Lopez is pitching in the 6th inning, gives up a single, it's like, hey man, you're at 100 pitches. Like, let's just wind you down for the night. Can you bring in Travis Adams to finish that inning? Yeah, I think so. Or maybe, it's Simeon Woods Richardson goes 5 shutout or something like that, or five runs or 5 innings, 2 runs. Hey man, good night. Let's wrap it up. 3rd time through the orders coming up. Travis Adams will get us through the 6th, and then we have our 7, 8, 9 plan. That, I think, you could find a decent pathway for Travis Adams to be that reliever. The problem is the Twins just have a lot of those guys where it's like, middle, low leverage, is probably the ceiling for them. Now, again, you need bullpen depth. You obviously need pitching depth, and it wasn't going to work for Travis Adams as a starter. There were so many bodies listed as starting pitchers on the Twins 40-man roster. The writing was on the wall, and notice they make that switch post-trade deadline when the Twins kind of have this influx of high minors, triple A, quad A players that kind of mix into this pitching rotation now that the Twins are going to have to sift through. So it really makes sense why Travis Adams is going to be taking his talents to the bullpen. He's a strong candidate to make the club, and I think he's got a better case than Marco Raya to make the club out of spring training, because the Twins have already ripped the Band-Aid off with him as a big leaguer. Marco Raya hasn't made his big league debut yet. Travis Adams already has. He's already has that clock ticking necessarily for service time and options and things like that. So you might as well call him up and give him that opportunity out of spring training. Again, if he's earned it, but I think he has a good case to earn it if he can show that fastball's got some life, he can get some swings and miss on the slider and the changeup. Maybe he just goes to being a fastball slider guy. That could also be on the table. Typically, you see when a guy goes to be a reliever, they got a deep pitch mix as a starter because you have to. You're facing guys 3 times. You're throwing 100 pitches. You need to throw multiple things at a guy. When you're a reliever, you're only going to face a guy once. Throw him 2 pitches, 3 pitches max, pitch types, and go all in on those ones, max effort. And that's typically why you see guys who aren't great starters go to the bullpen and become effective because they don't have to try and span out their workload over 6 innings. They can just go in, throw 15 pitches as hard as they can, and go on from there. And that's why you see that work out a little bit more. So I think Travis Adams has the best case out of him and Marco Raya to make the big league club out of spring training because he already has a little bit of big league experience and because there are some things you could see in St. Paul and a little bit with the Twins where you could see the pathway to being a nice middle reliever in this Twins bullpen. Doesn't mean he's going to be awesome. Doesn't mean he's going to have, a 3.2 ERA. But what it does say is if he can have, an ERA of maybe a little bit north of 3.5 and be in some leverage roles that are beneficial to him, don't put him in these huge spots, I think you could see a pathway for him being okay. I think you could, realistically. Now, Marco Raya, I think, is the higher ceiling player, despite the fact that he's probably not making the team out of spring training unless he really comes in and wows. Marco Raya is a lot more raw, but he has a lot more of those reliever qualities that could play as a higher leverage arm. Again, failed starter with Marco Raya. And one of the reasons, too, you kind of saw this coming is outside of guys who fail as starters just for not being able to pitch over a long inning span in a single game, you also see guys who are injured. You also see guys who have a tendency to get hurt. And so instead of making them pitch 6 innings every 5 days, you make them pitch 1 inning every 3 days, and you can find a way to still maximize their pitching ability while also keeping them healthy. Marco Raya has never pitched more than 100 innings in a season in his professional career. The Twins have been very cautious with him. He's a 4th-round pick in 2020. And over the course of his season in St. Paul, he made 30 appearances, 20 as a starter, had a 6.57 ERA over that span, had averaged around 9 strikeouts per 9 innings, but a high walk rate. And that's really where you see it. Injuries, tough time throwing strikes, but still has some raw stuff on his pitches where you could really see things working out. Has a potential to get that fastball into the 97 mile per hour range if you convert him to a reliever, so you could have him potentially be that flamethrower guy if he can control it. And that's going to be the thing for Marco Raya. If he can find a way to control his fastball, and if he can find a way to get a little more velocity on that, you could see things playing up. Again, he's got to earn it, and walks kill relievers a lot. So that's, again, I'm not saying this is a slam dunk. Marco Raya could come in someday and be the next Griffin Jax, Brock Stewart, Joan Duran, but he does have the capability of being the flamethrower. He's got some talent there. You're going to move him to the bullpen. It's going to be a better fit for him. You condense his workload. He also has a 6-pitch mix. You let the fastball go in terms of just letting it rip. And if you can control it, there is a path. If you can whittle down that pitch mix to a couple, maybe 3 pitches, it feels like he's going to start the year in St. Paul against converting over to that reliever type. It feels like they're going to test him out. Maybe he'll be the Saints closer to start the season. That's just kind of speculation on my part, but could start the year as the Saints closer and then move on from there to becoming a part of the Twins bullpen if he can prove himself down there. But he's going to need to be able to control his pitches. That's going to be the biggest thing. Staying healthy, finding control. And if he can do both of those, there is a path to potentially him being a higher leverage bullpen arm for the Minnesota Twins down the road. But it's interesting that Jeremy Zol listed those 2 by name, probably because those 2, the writing was on the wall and they already kind of started to make those changes a year ago. So it's pretty confident that you can say that. But I think there still are more moves to be made. And he hinted that basically we are going to do that. We're just not going to say who yet. They probably already know. They maybe have already even told the guys that, like, hey, we're going to give you a chance, but we want you to know that by the end of the spring, we need to have a conversation about becoming a reliever. He's just not going to say that yet. If you're looking at other things Jeremy Zoll said in the interview, nothing too drastic. He mainly just talked about Derek Falvey and his relationship with him and his background, Jeremy Zoll's background as a catcher, and just kind of littler things like that. Guys on the building he's going to lean on. Nothing super breakdown, this is kind of the deepest thing he really had to say in all of this. So we'll see what happens. It's contingent on spring training. It's contingent on injuries and performance and how things go. But Marco Raya's got a better chance to be that high-end talent guy. Travis Adams, though, much better case to make the big league club out of spring training. We're going to talk more about the Twins' offseason grades and why they're going to need to go back to school. There is a chance that they can improve it. Things aren't looking great for them, though. We're also going to talk about the number 2 Twins offseason moment and why it impacts them from the top man at the bench. That's all coming up right after this. Tax season doesn't have to take over your life. And this year, TurboTax is making it easier than ever to just hand things off and move on with your day. With TurboTax full service, you can have your taxes done for you by a trusted local expert, start to finish, without the stress or guesswork. They handle everything from W-2s to self-employment forms and work to get you every deduction. You can upload your documents, go about your day, and get updates in the TurboTax app. It's a huge time saver, and it gives real peace of mind knowing an expert is handling it. Instead of spending hours trying to figure out forms, you can meet with a TurboTax expert in person or even connect online. And for a limited time, you can have your taxes done by a local TurboTax expert for just $150 all in. If a TurboTax expert didn't file for you last year, just file by February 28th. Take your taxes off your plate and get back to your life. Visit TurboTax.com/local to book your appointment today. That's TurboTax. Thank you for making Locked On Twins your first listen of the day, and thank you for making Locked On the number 1 sports podcast network. If you haven't already, go check out our new Everydayer Club, which is access to an ad-free audio feed for Locked On Twins compatible with Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and every other major podcast app. You can go to lockedontwins.supercast.com or tap the link in the show notes to learn more. The Athletic has given their grades on the Minnesota Twins offseason report card. Not great, as they get a D on that report. And I think if you're listening, you're probably shaking your head like, yep. Honestly, I don't know how it could be anything, a D. Probably a lot of you thinking that they could maybe get an F out there with the way that this offseason has gone. But again, it's just been contingent on these offseason grades. On payroll, it's been on some of this other stuff. We'll talk about that. But first, Jim Bowden was the one who did these offseason rankings and talked about the grades for every team. Jim Bowden, of course, a former Major League Baseball general manager who now writes for The Athletic. And as I'm pulling it up here, trying to get the words that Bowden was putting out there about the Minnesota Twins and about the reason why they got a D on their report card, it has a lot to do with just the fact that they didn't really do anything in general. Their free agents, they added Josh Bell, 1 year, $7 million, Victor Caratini, 2 years, $14 million, Taylor Rogers, 1 year, $2 million. Those have been the big moves. Of course, the trade, acquiring Alex Jackson as a backup catcher, Eric Wagaman, a first baseman from the Marlins, and then got Tristan Gray from the Red Sox, who, again, all utility guys, all backup guys, platoon guys, and acquire Jace Kaminska for Ed Julian, as we talked about on the show last week. Go back and listen to that show for a full breakdown of that trade. But here's what his key takeaways are. Quote, the Twins have had a dismal offseason. Their only significant moves were signing first baseman Josh Bell, reliever Taylor Rogers, and catcher Victor Caratini. Those pickups help their roster depth, but likely won't improve their win-loss record. And now they'll enter spring training without their longtime baseball head, Derek Falvey, announcing on Friday that he and the team were mutually parting ways. He says their biggest question is can their best players, Pablo Lopez, Joe Ryan, Byron Buxton, and Royce Lewis, all stay healthy for the entire season. He predicts the Minnesota Twins to finish in 4th place in the AL Central, only the White Sox being worse than the team. And I think if you polled a lot of Twins fans, I think you just nod your head and go, that's fair. 4th place finish. Haven't really done much to add on to this team. The Royals aren't going anywhere. The Guardians aren't going anywhere. The Tigers just signed Framber Valdez to a deal. And if you look at that, you go, honestly, yeah, why the Twins' 4th place finish, offseason grades being a D, because I think if you look at a lot of the Twins' moves in a vacuum, they all make sense. But it's just addressing that elephant in the room of the bullpen that they have neglected, and it's been the theme of the week they need to do more for the bullpen. It's been the theme of the offseason. They've brought in Taylor Rogers. They've brought in a lot of nice low-level, low-wattage players, but they need to find a way to get a high-end reliever. And we'll be saying that until we're blue in the face on this show or until they develop one internally. There is major, major questions about who are going to close games out for the Twins. Who is going to be that guy that comes in? They did nothing to address that. And I think if you even make one move to get some high-level reliever, whether it be in the free agent market, whether it be in the trade market, I think you see that offseason grade bump all the way up from a D, maybe to even a B-. Because I think that the Twins really this season are relying on their internal prospects doing a lot of the heavy lifting for them, whether it's Walker Jenkins, whether it's Emmanuel Rodriguez, whether it's a Marco Raya coming up, whether it's a Connor Prelip joining the Twins bullpen. There's a Mick Abel, Taj Bradley. Some of these guys, they're relying on a lot of this internal stuff to carry them through, and it's not a bad bet if you really regard their farm system highly. MLB.com listed them as number 2 after the trade deadline. Baseball America, I think, has them at like 12th. So again, it's not a bad farm system, and a lot of the talent is at the top of the system, but they didn't really do much to help out a team that, despite the fact that they do have some young players coming up and they do have Byron Buxton, Pablo Lopez, Joe Ryan, it's a team that has no back end of the bullpen and also was a team that bottom 10 in baseball in runs scored. So they need to figure out a way to address that bullpen. They maybe could have took a bigger chance on a hitter, maybe went after, a Reese Hoskins, maybe went after somebody in the free agent market who had a little bit higher ceiling. I didn't really see that happening regardless, but the Twins are banking on their young players stepping up, and it's why you've seen the low offseason moves in terms of big splashes, in terms of big things happening. And I think we all need to talk about the elephant in the room, which has been the Twins offseason with ownership, which is, I think, why everybody knows this offseason has been as stagnant as it has been, and why the Twins have been a pretty boring offseason team the last few seasons because of the payroll cut. Derek Falvey has been a guy who will maneuver, he will do things, he will spend as much as ownership is willing to give him, and we saw that pre-2024 offseason. And when we got to that point, all of a sudden the biggest trade was Jorge Polanco, and it was a salary-cutting maneuver. And then we saw the trade deadline sell-off, which again was at the behest of ownership. So it's really tough to tell what this front office has planned because ownership just has kind of their hands in this thing, not necessarily that they are dictating what moves need to be made or they're telling them who to trade for and who to trade away, but just that they need payroll to be at X number of dollars and we have to get it there. And so I think while this offseason grade is a D, I think it could have very easily been an F, and like a huge F. So I think if you're listening out there and you go, I give the Twins offseason grade an F, trust me, it could have gotten lower. And here's why. They could have traded Joe Ryan at the trade deadline. They could have traded Joe Ryan this offseason. They could have traded Pablo Lopez this offseason. There was talk of Byron Buxton waiving his no trade clause to get out of here if they were going to sell off and continue to sell off. And they almost did that before the new minority owners came in the Twins enough cash to at least get out of the debt they were in. And now they can kind of proceed forward, basically plateauing instead of having to continue to sink. Now, that being said, the payroll is still going to be $30 million less than it was a year ago when you consider that they don't have Carlos Correa's contract on the books and a couple other things. So this could have been a lot worse if the Twins continued what they started at the trade deadline. And the only reason they didn't was just because the owners got the money they needed and basically could stop hemorrhaging cash at all costs. But now the Twins need to figure out how to pick up the pieces because the damage, you already took that genie out of the bottle of ripping away Carlos Correa, of ripping away all the bullpen arms. You can't just go, all right, now we're on to winning, because you haven't shown them that you're willing to win. You need to buy back fan trust that you almost traded away Joe Ryan, Pablo Lopez, Byron Buxton, and they haven't done anything to get that back. So while the front office gets a D, it goes with the organization as a whole, because that ownership group right now didn't allow the Twins to spend money up until late December, when a lot of those free agency conversations have already been ongoing, have already been happening. The Twins were too late to the party. And even if they wanted to spend a decent amount of money in free agency, who knows how much ownership was willing to give them to go make a splash. Because when they've had money, you've seen Derek Falvey splash on a Josh Donaldson, splash on a one-year deal for Carlos Correa, splash on the signing of Carlos Correa to a long-term contract. And then you also see, whether it's not all these moves worked out, but Lance Lynn and, I was about to say Fernando Romero. That is not who I was thinking. I was thinking Fernando Rodney, who is brought in at the trade deadline, for the Twins at the beginning of the 2018 spring training. You've seen the Twins be willing to get creative, even in dumping Donaldson and signing Correa and signing other free agents, trading for Sonny Gray. They've been willing to get creative and make moves, but with ownership taking away the payroll, it's also taken away the creativity of the Twins to go with this roster. And you've heard the Twins say we have to be creative with our roster construction. That basically means we don't have money. How can we find a way to get this team better without taking a massive step back? And that's been hard. And it sounds really easy, and they just can't find a way to do it. And it comes from ownership. So offseason grade is a D. I think it's a little harsh. I maybe would put it at a C minus. But at the end of the day, you're in a bad spot with your offseason because you don't have money to do anything. And even if the Twins did have money, what moves would they really have been able to pull off? That's the other thing that you have to look at. But that's what the Twins have been put at in terms of their offseason report card. I got to assume that if you're listening, you probably agree, but maybe you don't. Maybe you have a different perspective on the Twins offseason. Let me know your Twins offseason grade in the comments if you're watching on YouTube. We are going to wrap up the show and talk a little bit about the number two offseason move of the Minnesota Twins. We touched on number 3 yesterday. Go back and listen to that. We touched on number 1 a couple days ago because of the whole Derek Falvey of it all was definitely the number 1 in the ownership transition and things like that. We are going to reveal number 2 and why it would have been number 1 had it not been for what actually made number 1. We're going to talk about all that and more coming up right after this. Hiring isn't just about finding someone willing to take the job. It's about finding the right person with the right background who can actually help your business move forward. And if you want candidates who match what you're looking for, Indeed sponsored jobs is the move. Because instead of hoping the right person stumbles across your post, Indeed helps you match with quality candidates by boosting your job listing to the people who fit your specific criteria: life skills, certifications, and location. That's why I like Indeed. You can get specific and target exactly what you need. It saves time because you're spending less energy sorting through mismatches, and with sponsored jobs, you get your posts seen by candidates who are actually a fit. If I were hiring, I wouldn't just want someone who can help. I'd want someone with real experience who can jump right in. And here's a stat that says it all. In the minute I've been talking to you, companies like yours have made 27 hires on Indeed, according to Indeed data worldwide. So if you're hiring, spend less time searching and more time interviewing candidates who check all your boxes with Indeed sponsored jobs. The number 2 moment of the Minnesota Twins offseason is bringing in Derek Shelton, firing Rocco Baldelli. It'd be number 1 in almost any offseason had it not been for the whole ownership fiasco. And it's very fascinating in ownership and the sale, in the offseason moves, in the Derek Falvey stepping down. What gets lost in all this is that the Twins have a new manager in 2026. And I know it can get lost on some of you because I don't really think the Twins wanted to make a huge manager change going into 2026. Dan Hayes of The Athletic was on the Foul Territory podcast last week and made a comment that Derek Falvey didn't even really want to fire Rocco Baldelli. There's a lot of fans in Twins territory who wanted Rocco Baldelli gone. And look, I'm not going to sit here and tell you Rocco Baldelli was the top 5 manager in baseball and that the Twins did him a great injustice by firing him. What I will say is I think he got overhated, especially towards the end. And I think because he's the manager and the front-facing guy of the team, just had to take those slings and arrows. It's part of the job. I don't think Rocco Baldelli deserves blame for everything going wrong with this Twins team. But regardless, he also was the guy who was in charge of 2 collapses, 2024 and 2025, and you could even go back to the 2022 collapse. So there's a lot of things where you could look at Rocco Baldelli and say, yeah, he's made the playoffs 3 times over the course of his managerial career, but 2 of those times were his first 2 seasons, and in the last 5 years has only made the playoffs once. And there's not really a case to keep a manager after that point, at least a good one, even if I personally didn't mind Rocco Baldelli being the manager of this team. But that being said, the Twins didn't want to make a move. And I said to all the people who wanted Rocco Baldelli fired, I said that, you're not gonna like the next guy the Twins bring in either. Because if Derek Falvey is still in place, and he was at the time of hiring a manager, you are going to basically get a guy who's going to do the things that Rocco Baldelli did. Maybe not exactly the same, but you're going to get a guy who will agree with the front office. You're still going to get somebody who the front office handpicked. And Rocco Baldelli was handpicked by Derek Falvey, and Derek Shelton was now handpicked by Derek Falvey. Now, the fascinating wrinkle is Derek Falvey's gone. And again, it goes to the timing of this whole thing with ownership coming in and Derek Falvey mutually agreeing to part ways with the team. And it kind of just goes into saying that the Twins have a new manager in 2025, and it'd be very fast 2026, and it'd be very fascinating to see if after 2025, had the Twins just gotten rid of Derek Falvey and brought in somebody new, how different does that managerial search look? It's very fascinating. You rarely see in baseball kind of a manager and a GM both get kind of clean swept out of a building. You see it a lot in football. You don't really see it as much in baseball. And especially with the Twins, when they brought in Derek Falvey, they said Paul Molitor's got to be your manager. He was manager for 2 years, and then they brought in Rocco Baldelli, and now Rocco Baldelli fired, bring in Derek Shelton from Falvey, and now Falvey is gone, and whoever the Twins bring in, whether Jeremy Zoll just takes over the front office entirely, or whether they bring in somebody next offseason, it again just kind of messes up that pairing a little bit. But I still think Derek Shelton is a very much in-house Twins guy. Derek Shelton worked a little bit in the organization when Jeremy Zoll was there in 2018 and 2019. But, they just didn't really see each other as Shelton was the bench coach. It was more with the players day to day, and Zoll was working in the front office. There's not a ton of collaboration you do with him, but they definitely had some work together over the course of the offseason. But I think, and this was my take before Derek Falvey got fired about the Twins, again, got fired, mutually agreed to part ways, whatever you want to say. Derek Falvey's not with the organization anymore. Here's the thing. Derek Falvey left the organization. But before he did, I said, even though I don't agree with this hire, and I think there are much better managerial candidates you could have brought in instead of Derek Shelton. I would have even took a chance on Nick Punto or Kurt Suzuki or even Torrey Hunter taking a chance on this team. Shelton was just not my first guy. But that being said, you have to let the people in charge put the people they want in place. It's even why I said if Tom Pohlad didn't really want Derek Falvey in the organization, let him bring in his own guy anyways. And it's why if Derek Falvey was still the president of baseball operations, you have to let him pick his guy and do the things he wants. Why make somebody do something they don't want to do and make them go against their decision-making? At that point, why do you even have them in charge? And so that was my take with Derek Shelton managing in general. But what I do think, and that's kind of, again, just all the mess that goes to the managerial stuff. But if you want to put a positive spin on Derek Shelton being the manager, I think you can look at it this way. Even though Rocco Baldelli has this persona of being laid back and a chill dude and clubhouse vibes and all that kind of stuff, his personality definitely wasn't meshing well with some of the guys in the clubhouse, whether it felt like things were weird at times with Carlos Correa, whether it felt like they were weird at times with Royce Lewis. Of course, there was that Griffin Jacks, Rocco Baldelli interaction in the dugout. Not that things always were like throwing punches, but just from a vibes perspective, you could definitely tell things felt off at times. The biggest reason was just that they weren't winning games, and that's always the biggest thing. If you're winning, vibes are great. Everybody loves Rocco after 2023. There wasn't exactly that same sentiment after 2024, and especially after 2025, and losing definitely plays a part in that. But I think overall, when you look at Derek Shelton, he's much different tonally than Rocco Baldelli, even if they are going to be similar in terms of the moves they make, in terms of the lineups they construct, in terms of the bullpen decisions they go with. It is pretty much going to be the same as Rocco Baldelli. The difference is going to be in how he manages the clubhouse. The Twins had it with Baldelli, a guy who was laid back and, kind of that laid back persona. When you have Derek Shelton now, he's a little more boisterous. He does more media. He's out in front of a microphone. He's talking. He's got the beard. He looks like Santa Claus. There's a lot of this stuff where you look at Derek Shelton, he just seems like a more outgoing personality. And not that Rocco Baldelli wasn't, but it's just a different kind of thing with Rocco. And I think you could see Derek Shelton coming in, being a breath of fresh air into the clubhouse. And not that Baldelli didn't embolden Royce Lewis, but maybe just a different guy to talk to Royce and try and get through to him the things the organization wants to do, and a couple other guys with the team. And I think he does fit because he has that past experience being the team's bench coach with a guy like Taylor Rogers, with a guy like Byron Buxton. Those are some of the two most important players on your team, and they already have a past experience with the manager. So I don't think Derek Shelton is going to be winning manager of the year this year. I don't know how long his future is with the Twins. It might just be babysitting kind of the next few years until the organization gets in the new president of baseball ops and brings in their own manager. But either way, you can see things working with Derek Shelton if his personality ends up just being the change that needed to happen over Rocco. I don't really see things changing in terms of, I think quick hook Rocco was, I don't agree with that. I'm not somebody who bought into all of the quick hook stuff, but you're going to see similar pullings from Derek Shelton. So you're going to see similar platooning and lineup constructions. I don't think that's changing. That's why the Twins brought in Shelton. They brought in the closest thing to Rocco Baldelli decision-making they could. But there is a difference with the personality of Derek Shelton. And in today's day and age of Major League Baseball, being the right personality for a team means so much. So there you go. Top 5 moments of the Minnesota Twins offseason. Number 5 was the Josh Bell signing. Taylor Rogers, number 4. Victor Carantini, number 3, bringing in him to be the backup catcher. And number 2, Rocco Baldelli out, Derek Shelton in as Twins skipper. And number 1, Derek Falvey and the Twins mutually agreeing to part ways as the head of the Minnesota Twins. And that's paired in with the minority owners and Tom Pohlad taking over. A huge change at the top of the Minnesota Twins compared to a year ago at this time. That's going to do it for Locked On Twins. Thanks for tuning into the show today. Tomorrow, we're going to be taking a look at all of the free agency and the moves that have been happening with the AL Central when it comes to Framber Valdez going to the Detroit Tigers. What does that mean for the Twins, who were rumored to be in on him at the very end? We'll talk about that and more, all coming up on tomorrow's show. You can find me on X at BombCJ30. Make sure you subscribe and follow Locked On Twins to get all the latest episodes. If you never miss an episode, the Everydayer Club is built for you. Get Locked On Twins ad-free, plus members-only Discord access and more. Head to lockedontwins.supercast.com to join the club. For those of you on video, we send you to the first ever 24/7 national Locked On Podcast Network YouTube channel. On audio, make sure your second listen is Locked On MLB. See ya.